While most history books highlight the achievements of the Islamic Golden Age in science, medicine, and culture, they rarely pause to mention what happened to the millions of people who resisted conversion during the rapid spread of Islamic rule. The official policies of many medieval caliphates toward conquered populations were not random acts of cruelty, but organized systems of control. And when you compare these methods to what was happening in medieval Europe, the picture looks far harsher on the Islamic side. What's important to understand is that much of what we know doesn't just come from European critics, but from Muslim chroniclers themselves. These records describe a pattern of conquest that went beyond winning battles. It was about dismantling the will of entire communities and reshaping their identities. For example, one of the most chilling systems developed under the Ottomans was the practice known as the devshirme, often called the blood tax. In the Balkans, Christian families lived with the constant dread of Ottoman officials arriving in their villages every few years. Their task was to select young boys, usually between 8 and 18, based on their health, intelligence, and physical strength. Parents were powerless. If they resisted, they risked the execution of the whole family. Mothers and fathers were forced to watch as their children were taken, fully aware that they would never return home. Once collected, the boys were marched to Istanbul. There, they were forced to abandon their religion, cut ties with their families, and take on a new identity within the Ottoman system. They could not speak their native language, remember their customs, or practice Christianity. Instead, they were drilled in military discipline and loyalty to the Sultan. The most capable among them were shaped into the Janissaries, one of the most feared elite forces in the medieval world. The psychological side of this system was just as brutal as the physical. Children were told that their Christian families had given them up, and that the Sultan had rescued them. Over time, many came to believe this, serving loyally in the very army that conquered the lands of their birth. Historians estimate that between the mid-14th century and the early 19th century, anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million boys were taken this way. Generations grew up under the shadow of this practice, and villages across the Balkans lived in constant fear of the next levy. Families tried everything to shield their children. Some injured their sons on purpose, making them unfit for selection. Others sent them into hiding when the collectors were near. But the Ottoman reach was wide, and very few children escaped once they were marked. The irony is heartbreaking. The strongest sons of Christian families were reshaped into weapons used to suppress more Christian communities. It was a cycle that fed itself for centuries. And the devshirme was only one side of a much larger system of slavery that stretched across the Islamic world. While the Atlantic slave trade operated for roughly 4 centuries, the Islamic slave trade lasted for over 1,400 years, from the 7th century until the early 20th. Estimates suggest that between 11 and 17 million Africans were enslaved and transported into Islamic territories, though some researchers believe the real figure was far higher. But here's the part that stands out most when comparing it to the Atlantic system. In Islamic slave markets, large numbers of male captives were castrated. Scholars estimate that up to 80 to 90% of enslaved men were subjected to this procedure, either before they were transported or immediately after arrival. Few survived it, which is why the number of enslaved Africans in Islamic lands has always been difficult to trace precisely. The practice of castration carried a horrifying cost. Nearly 9 out of 10 boys who went through the procedure died. For many, it wasn't a path to slavery but a slow execution. The castration centers were not small hidden rooms. They were large, organized facilities. One of the most notorious was in Aswan, Egypt, where thousands of young men and boys were processed every year. Those who somehow survived became eunuchs, permanently stripped of their ability to reproduce and forever marked as property. This was no accident. It was policy. Islamic law allowed slavery, but it also encouraged masters to free slaves, especially if they converted to Islam. That might sound merciful at first glance, but the castration system had a different purpose. By ensuring slaves couldn't have children, societies created an endless need for fresh captives while avoiding the complications of a permanent slave population that could grow too large to control. For women, the situation was just as cruel. only in different ways. The most attractive were forced into harems and concubinage, while others spent their lives doing household labor. Unlike the Americas, where enslaved families could sometimes form communities and pass on their culture, Islamic slavery worked to prevent such bonds from ever forming. The Mamluk system shows how far this idea was taken. Young boys from the Caucasus and Central Asia were purchased, converted, and turned into soldiers. Over time, the Mamluks grew powerful enough to overthrow their rulers and control Egypt and Syria for more than 2 centuries. But even after gaining power, they didn't dismantle the system. Instead, they kept importing new slaves to fill the ranks, refusing to allow their own children to inherit military authority. It was a cycle without end. The damage to the regions supplying these slaves was massive. Entire parts of Africa were emptied out by raids. Continuous warfare to capture new slaves destroyed farming, trade, and social life. Some regions never recovered, even after centuries. Arab historians like al-Tabari and Ibn Battuta recorded details of these markets and castration practices in a matter-of-fact way, as if they were just another routine part of economic life. To them, it was normal. That's the disturbing part. What looked horrific to outsiders was treated as ordinary business inside the system. But slavery wasn't the only way Islamic rulers controlled subject peoples. Another tool was the dhimmi system, which created legal and economic pressure on non-Muslims. A special head tax, known as the jizya, was imposed. It wasn't a light burden, often equal to several months' wages, enough to ruin families who tried to keep their faith. The way it was collected was designed to humiliate. Non-Muslims had to pay publicly, sometimes being slapped or forced to kneel while handing over the money. And even when paid, that tax didn't buy equality. At the same time, religious buildings were systematically targeted. When Arab armies entered Egypt in 641 AD, they didn't just capture cities. They began tearing down Coptic monasteries and churches. These weren't only holy places. They were also centers of learning that preserved ancient Egyptian traditions. Persia saw the same pattern. Zoroastrian temples, some of which had burned sacred flames for more than 1,000 years, were extinguished. Sacred texts were burned, and priests were either killed or pressured to convert. A faith that had once been the backbone of an empire was reduced to a small minority in just a few generations. The story was repeated in India. Mahmud of Ghazni's invasions between 1000 and 1027 AD were particularly destructive. His own court writers bragged about demolishing more than 50,000 Hindu temples and forcing countless conversions. The Somnath Temple, one of the holiest sites in Hinduism, was torn down, and its stones were used to build mosque steps. This wasn't random destruction, it was psychological warfare. By destroying the visible symbols of rival religions, conquerors sent a clear message: your gods cannot protect you, ours has triumphed. Forced conversions often followed right in the ruins of these temples, driving home the point. And even where other faiths survived, the law pushed them into second-class status. Christians and Jews were barred from building new places of worship, ringing bells, or holding processions. They weren't allowed to testify against Muslims in court, ride horses, or carry weapons. The result was a kind of legal segregation that made non-Muslims outsiders in their own homelands. Over time, the impact was crushing. Once thriving Christian communities in North Africa, which had produced great thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, faded out of existence. Whole cultures were erased, not only through war but through systematic legal, social, and religious pressure. The Zoroastrian faith, once the dominant religion of Persia with millions of followers, has today dwindled to fewer than 200,000 people worldwide. What was once a powerful tradition, rooted in centuries of culture, was nearly erased from its homeland. Alongside this decline, Islamic Caliphates institutionalized sexual slavery on a scale far greater than most other historical examples. The harem system wasn't only about royal indulgence, it functioned as a tool of control. By capturing and exploiting women from conquered communities, rulers broke the spirit of entire populations. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, remembered in the stories of 1001 Nights, reportedly kept more than 2,000 women in his harem. These women, taken from across the empire, lived as sexual property, discarded when they lost beauty or favor. When Baghdad was captured by the Mongols in 1258, the last Abbasid caliph's harem still held over 700 women. Chroniclers describe how they were raped and slaughtered as the city burned, abruptly ending centuries of institutionalized slavery in the Abbasid capital. The practice of concubinage had been woven into law itself. Concubines were legally defined as property. They could be bought, sold, or gifted, and had no personal rights. Their children were often denied inheritance unless formally recognized by the father. Slave markets across Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad openly traded women, with travelers like Ibn Battuta recording how they were displayed unclothed before potential buyers. Prices for the most attractive women could reach the equivalent of several years' salary for a skilled craftsman. The psychological weight on families was immense. Parents feared their daughters would be targeted. Some scarred their daughters' faces to make them less desirable to raiders. Others kept them locked indoors, a practice that contributed to long-term cultural norms of female seclusion. Because concubines were constantly replaced, the demand for new captives never ended. Raids focused heavily on capturing young women, leaving lasting scars on the demographic balance of many regions. The Ottoman Empire alone is believed to have enslaved more than 1.5 million women for sexual purposes between the 14th and 19th centuries. These captives came from the Balkans, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Africa, representing dozens of ethnic groups and communities. Islamic law was used to justify and regulate the system. Verses in the Quran about those whom your right hand possesses were interpreted as divine permission for sexual access to enslaved women. Religious scholars then built detailed legal codes that governed the trade and use of concubines, presenting the practice as sanctioned by God. The impact was devastating. Removing large numbers of young women tore apart family life, disrupted cultural traditions, and left many societies unable to recover their strength. Generations grew up under this pressure. And sexual slavery was only one part of a larger strategy. Islamic Caliphates also mastered the use of economic warfare. Taxes on conquered peoples weren't designed for fairness. They were meant to drain resources and keep populations dependent. In many places, the land tax took between half and 4/5 of everything farmers produced, leaving families with barely enough to survive. Over time, this relentless economic pressure hollowed out entire regions, binding them to their rulers not through loyalty but through enforced poverty. When farmers could no longer pay their crushing taxes, their land was seized. Sometimes it was handed over to Muslim settlers, other times it was converted into religious endowment property. The conquest of Persia under the Umayyads shows how deliberate this policy could be. The advanced Sasanian irrigation systems, which had sustained Persian farming for centuries, weren't simply neglected. They were intentionally broken down or left to collapse. This wasn't carelessness. It was a calculated move to make economic recovery impossible and keep communities dependent on their new rulers. Tribute demands often went beyond money or crops. Some required quotas of human beings. The Nubians, for example, were forced to hand over 400 slaves every year to the Fatimid Caliphate. The Bulgars had to supply young men for military service. These human taxes drained local populations and at the same time gave the caliphates a steady flow of labor and soldiers. Trade itself was reshaped into a form of economic segregation. Non-Muslims were locked out of certain professions or weighed down by heavy business taxes. Over time, this shifted power into the hands of Muslim merchants while impoverishing others. The overall effect was devastating. Wealthy regions that had once been thriving centers of agriculture and trade became poor within just a few generations. Resistance was not only dangerous but financially impossible, leaving conversion as the only path to survival. But conquest wasn't just about money. It was also about erasing memory and identity. What we now call cultural genocide. The caliphates didn't simply defeat armies. They worked to wipe out entire civilizations. Libraries and learning centers were deliberately destroyed. In Alexandria, the remnants of the legendary library that had once been the beating heart of the ancient world were burned. In Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, royal archives containing centuries of Persian knowledge were reduced to ash. Language was another weapon. Arabic became the official language of administration, education, and religion. Local tongues slowly faded away. Coptic, the last descendant of ancient Egyptian language, was pushed into church rituals only, and eventually vanished from daily life. Cities and landmarks were renamed, replacing identities thousands of years old with Arabic terms. These weren't small administrative choices. They were deliberate acts of erasure. Religious and cultural festivals were also targeted. The Persian New Year, Nowruz, was banned in many places. Hindu festivals in India were forbidden. Traditions that had defined communities for centuries were suddenly outlawed as un-Islamic. Architecture too was rewritten. Pre-Islamic temples, palaces, and monuments were systematically destroyed or repurposed into mosques. The message was blunt: the past had no worth, only Islamic culture was to be preserved. Schools that once taught local knowledge were closed or converted into madrasas, which taught only Islamic subjects. With that, the transmission of cultural memory was broken. Young generations grew up knowing only what their conquerors wanted them to know. The results were permanent. Ancient Egyptian civilization, which had survived Persian, Greek, and Roman rule while keeping its character, disappeared within a few centuries of Arab conquest. Zoroastrian Persia, once a center of philosophy and literature, was reduced to a faint echo of its former self. The destruction was so complete that we're still piecing together what was lost. Archaeology continues to uncover traces of civilizations that were deliberately wiped from memory. Whole chapters of human history exist now only in scattered fragments. What the Caliphates built was not just an empire, but one of the most efficient systems of conquest and cultural erasure in history. Their methods: military domination, economic suffocation, cultural suppression, and enslavement were not accidents of war. They were policies, carefully designed to break the spirit of conquered peoples. Civilizations that had survived countless invasions vanished within a few generations of Islamic expansion. When we study these events, we don't just see the past. We recognize a pattern that still exists in different forms today: the attempt to erase alternative ways of life and impose a single dominant culture. The weapons may have changed, but the goal remains strikingly familiar.